Hey guys, I'm coming to you today to read you another picture book that took place during the time of slavery. So far, I read you January Sparrow. I read you Pink and Say, although I don't have it here at my house because I read to you from that story at the school, so it's at school. Yesterday, I finished up reading Just in Time Abraham Lincoln. And these were all stories that were related to slavery and the fight against slavery during the Civil War. Today I'm going to read you another book called The Price of Freedom. And this one will take us a couple of days to read. But this is a story, it says The Price of Freedom, how one town stood up to slavery. Now, I printed out a little map here for you. And of course, you know that this is a map of our state of Ohio. And there's a little compass rose up here that tells us which way is north. This is the north. And we know that in the northern states, um, they did not permit slavery there. And right here along the bottom of our state of Ohio is the Ohio River. It goes here and then it goes all the way over into Indiana. It goes clear up here into even up to into Pennsylvania. But south of here, so if you look at Compass Rose, this is south. So south of Ohio, the states were slave states. And so as we found out in January Sparrow, so many of the slaves who escaped, they wanted to get past the Ohio River. And we remember that the girl in the boat who took them across the river, she told them that when they were halfway across the river, she said, the fish on this side of the river are free, and the fish on this side of the river are are slaves or whatever. They're not free. Okay. So anyway, this is a map of our Ohio, and this is our Ohio River. So you can tell that Ohio played a big role in the fight against slavery. And this is actually a map of some of the Underground Railroad routes that would have happened during that time. So all these little lines, these squiggly lines that are in there, these are all Underground Railroad, kind of the path that they took so that they could make their way. This is Michigan up here, that's north of us, but they could make their way to Canada where they could ultimately be free from slavery. So the story that we're reading today takes place kind of in this area over here. So we know that the person who escaped in this story, I don't remember exactly because I don't think I've read the whole story before, but they were a slave and they made their way up here. And then they got up to this town called Oberlin, Ohio. And there's actually a college, a university there now, and there was then too. But we found out in January Sparrow that there was a law called the Fugitive Slave Law. And even though you came from the South, you crossed the Ohio River, your slave catcher or your master could still come into this free state and take you back. And ultimately, probably like January, beat you to death, possibly. And the people who housed or hid the slaves were charged a big giant fine. I think it was $1,000 per slave that they captured, or that they hid. And then they also had to do 6 months jail time for that. So the fugitive slave law didn't completely protect the slaves from slavery. Even though they came north of the Ohio River, they still were not completely safe. That's why in January Sparrow, in the Crosswhites, they had to get all the way up here to Canada. And so, and then of course we found out later when we read Pink and Say and then Just in Time Abraham Lincoln that because of so many people against slavery, the country was divided. And that's why the Civil War happened, because the country was tearing apart because of slavery. That was the one of the biggest issues in that. So today I want to read to you The Price of Freedom, and again it takes place up in this northeastern part of Ohio, and I think. Yeah, I don't see Oberlin is not on there, but it is up in that area where this took place. So, The Price of Freedom is the name of the story, and it says how one town stood up to slavery. So I'm going to turn my computer around here so you can see the pictures. Hopefully I don't mess up my words since I've never read this story before. One frigid night in 1856, John Price and his cousin Dinah took 2 horses from their master's barn. They galloped to a nearby farm to pick up their friend Frank. Then the 3 Kentucky slaves rode to the frozen Ohio River. If they could cross to the other side, they would be in Ohio, where slavery was outlawed. So they came from Kentucky. They rode across the ice safely, but ran into trouble at the Ohio shore. In the darkness, they couldn't find a way up their icy riverbank. The 3 runaway slaves searched all night, but didn't spot a path until dawn. By the time they scrambled onto the free soil of Ohio, their hands and feet were numb with cold. A short way into Ohio, they met an elderly Quaker. Now, Quakers was a kind of religious group, and they were all about peace. And they had no desire to have war. And they also were abolitionists. And abolitionists were people who did not believe in slavery. So anytime they could help a slave, they did. A short way into Ohio, they met an elderly Quaker. The runaways needed help getting off the horses, which immediately ran back home across the frozen river. The Quaker gentleman then led the 3 fugitive slaves to his house and sheltered them for 2 weeks. When they had recovered from their journey, the trio split, perhaps to confuse the slave hunters searching for 2 men and a woman. Dinah went off alone. John and Frank traveled northward together, mostly at night, usually on foot, always following the North Star. They moved slowly, for John had a deformed foot that made walking through the ice, snow, and mud terribly painful. But move they must. 6 years earlier, Congress had passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. It allowed slave owners to capture runaways anywhere on the U.S. soil, even in free states like Ohio, and made aiding escaped slaves a federal crime. The only true safe place for the fugitive slaves was Canada, which had ended slavery in 1834. John and Frank received help on their journey. Some people, such as the elderly Quaker, defied the Fugitive Slave Act by turning their homes into Underground Railroad stations. These rest stops for runaway slaves were located about every 10 miles. Each night, the 2 friends continued northward. Each morning, they sought shelter for the day at an Underground Railroad station. After a few weeks, John and Frank reached Lake Erie. There they learned that they could not yet go to Canada because ice in the lake was blocking boat traffic. They decided to spend the rest of the winter in one of the nation's busiest Underground Railroad stops, Oberlin, Ohio, about 200 miles from where they started. Oberlin College professors and the town's ministers claimed there was a higher law than the Fugitive Slave Act. This was the law of right and wrong, by which everyone deserved to be free. Between the 1830s and the 1850s, Oberlin people sheltered 3,000 runaway slaves. Many of the slaves felt so safe and welcome in the town that they settled there instead of moving on to Canada. By the 1850s, about 400 of Oberlin's 2,000 residents were African Americans, most of them escaped slaves. Kind of sounds like the Crosswhites who lived in Marshall, Michigan for several years. While they waited for the ice to clear, John lodged with a farmer and Frank lived nearby. Both men worked at odd jobs. By spring, the two friends liked Oberlin so much they decided to stay there. Trouble began in early September 1858 when a 10-year-old boy spied several rough-looking men on the porch of an Oberlin flophouse. Suspecting that they were slave hunters, Oberlin people posted lookouts around the hotel. Indeed, the men were slave hunters. They were led by Anderson Jennings, a Kentuckian who had been promised $500 per slave, equal to about $13,000 each in today's money, for returning John and Frank to their former owners. On Sunday, September 12th, Jennings visited the Boyntons, one of the area's few families that favored the fugitive slave law. He offered 13-year-old Shakespeare Boynton $20 to help him capture the two runaways. The next morning, Shake Boynton drove a horse and a buggy to the farm where John Price lived. He asked if John and Frank wanted to earn some money digging potatoes. John told Shake he couldn't because he had to take care of Frank, who was recovering from an injury. However, another friend of his might want the job. John went with Shake to show him where his friend lived. John and young Shake Boynton were traveling along a dirt road when three of Jennings' accomplices pulled up next to them. The men pulled their guns on John. "I'll go with you," he said, realizing that resisting would be useless. The slave hunters drove John toward Wellington, a town 9 miles south of Oberlin. As the carriage passed a cemetery, John noticed a tall, bearded Oberlin College student walking along the road. John shouted that he was being kidnapped, but the young man didn't seem to hear him. 2:30 p.m. After Shake reported to Anderson Jennings and pocketed his reward, Jennings headed to Wellington. He holed up with his accomplices and John Price in the attic of Wadsworth Hotel. A southbound train was due in Wellington at 5:13 p.m. Jennings planned to board that train with John Price, return John to his master, and claim his $500 reward. Ansel Lyman, the Oberlin student on the road, had heard John's cries for help. As soon as the carriage was out of sight, he raced into the Oberlin, yelling that the slave catchers had John Price as their prisoner on the road to Wellington. Within minutes, hundreds of Oberlinians set out for Wellington. Farmers, shopkeepers, and ministers hurried off to rescue John Price. So did Oberlin College professors and students. Young and old, men and women, fathers and sons, black and white, armed and unarmed. People jammed the roads in carts and buggies, on foot and on horseback. And we will stop there. But this is them all looking around. All right. So that is the beginning of the story, how one town stood up to slavery. So tomorrow we will finish that. Story. So we did find out that he actually did escape from Kentucky, which is the state just south of Ohio, and they were heading north. Like I said earlier, Michigan is right up in here, and north of Michigan is Canada, where they were trying to get to. So, all right, so tune in tomorrow for the second part.